know me, I'm Yael Aronoff. I'm the director of the Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel at MSU. And we're excited and maybe frustrated to be with you a fourth time in the past 2 years with Israeli elections. The first time I think I was talking to you in James Madison College, and then we did another session with Alan Tao and another session with Ellie Rekhess, Professor Ellie Rekhess will be joining us in a half an hour. There was a mix up between the time change that he forgot about between us and Chicago, but he'll join us. So this is our fourth time around. I'll introduce Professor Alan Tao since he's here. But before I do that, I want to remind you of our next two events this week, our final events of the semester. And many of you have been coming to many of our events. So tomorrow from 12:30 to 2, we're having our annual Rabin Brill Holocaust lecture. It'll be Neighbors in Difficult Times, Jews and Gentiles in the Borderlands of the Soviet Union and Romania during the Holocaust. And it'll be by Dr. Diana Dumitru. Should be a fascinating lecture. And then on Friday from 8:45 till 5, we have an all-day I think 5th annual Sterling Institute Undergraduate Research Conference with 14 of our students presenting their exciting research. You're all welcome to join. We have our different faculty acting as respondents and there to support. Their families and friends are invited. We have a keynote by one of our alumni, and we're recognizing 2 of our students with awards. So please join us on Friday. So before we get started, let me introduce Professor Alan Tao. Many of you know him because he's come every fall for part of the fall to teach either classes on the environment in Israel or climate change across the world, and recently Israeli politics, cultures, and society class. He's a professor of public policy at Tel Aviv University, and he's among the founding members of Israel's Blue and White Party and has run on their list of candidates for Knesset 4 times and in the most recent election. And he oversaw their sustainability platform and campaign. So we're kind of getting insider information here, a minute by minute inside information on Blue and White Party and other kind of insights into Israeli politics. He also used to be the co-chair of Israel's Green Party. He founded the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies, a graduate studies center in which students, Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian students tackle common environmental challenges and solutions together. He's the author and co-editor of 11 books, several by Yale University Press, several award winners. They include with Michael Keital and Ekenin and Linda Strauss-Buchan as editors, Climate Change, Environment, and National Security, A New Front. That was published this year. Award-winning The Land is Full, Addressing Overpopulation in Israel, All the Trees of the Forest, Israel's Woodlands from Antiquity to the Present. Water Wisdom, Preparing the Groundwork for Cooperative and Sustainable Water Management in the Middle East, that he co-edited with Abed Rabo. And Pollution in a Promised Land, Environmental History of Israel are some of those publications. So it's always amazing how much Alan Tao can accomplish in terms of his publications, his activist work, his environmental work, and also his presence with us at MSU. So welcome back, Alan Tao. So I'm gonna get us started for the first 20 minutes, then Professor Alan Tao will speak for 20 minutes, then we'll have Ellie Rekhess join us and I'll introduce him. I'll be talking about mainly kind of Netanyahu and possible coalitions and their implications, and Professor Alan Tao will be talking about blue and white, but also what's happening in terms of the religious vote, ultra-Orthodox, and Ellie Rekhess and implications for the future. And Ellie Rekhess will focus on the Arab-Israeli vote and their significant, real significance in this election. So what is going on in Israel, right? To have 4 elections in 2 years, and apparently a recent poll showed that 80% of Israelis think that there'll be a 5th election in the coming year. So as I've suggested in the past panels, we all know that one of the reasons for this is that Israel is an extremely polarized society, and you basically have a relative static kind of position between the two the center right bloc and the center left bloc in each of these elections, which is why one of the reasons you keep having elections, in addition to the large number of parties running because the relatively still low threshold for the voting. But in each election, you basically see shifts mostly within the center-right bloc and within the center-left bloc. But the two blocs, their numbers don't change all that much from one election to another election and just become stagnated in terms of the real difficulty because of the divisions of producing coalitions or coalitions that last. And so that's certainly one of the reasons why we keep seeing this. Now, I'll be, of course, concentrating on Benjamin Netanyahu. And he's Israel's longest serving prime minister. He's been serving for the past 12 years. So that should be and is a signifier of Israel's, in some respects, trend to the right in terms of its politics in the last dozen years. But we also want to be careful, and I've mentioned this in past forums on Israeli elections last 2 years, that we don't exaggerate necessarily this shift or treat it in a monolithic kind of uniform way. Because of course, some on the right in terms of parties have split off into center parties. Part of the right has kind of shifted their policies and at least becoming relatively more pragmatic on some issues, like two states. So you don't get this uniform kind of linear rightward shift. I've been going to different panels on Israeli politics because I love to hear different perspectives on it. So I attended the one that UCLA, the Nazarene Institute at UCLA had last week, and Oded Cheklai, one of my colleagues, was also mentioning, and I'll quote you, Oded, that there are multiple trends happening simultaneously to explore the trend to the right. And even though the younger generation does affiliate in terms of identity more to the right, it doesn't necessarily mean that they adopt all the positions of the right, and some may be amenable to a two-state solution, and some are for LGBTQ plus rights, right? So you can't, they don't, it doesn't necessarily mean all one thing if someone in a poll identifies as being right. Nevertheless, right, Netanyahu has been in power for quite a long time, and he seems to be part of a global trend, at least in some countries, where we're seeing lots of kind of nationalist, populist leaders who challenge democratic institutions and checks in some ways that we see in many countries around the world, and of course that we saw in our country as well. And so part of what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is kind of the weakening over time of Netanyahu, and arguably he's in the weakest position he's ever been in the past 12 years. And does that portend also a decline of some of these leaders, as we saw in the US in the past election? It's certainly possible that he won't succeed in forming election. So I thought it'd be interesting before I get into Netanyahu, because to look at this kind of not, kind of broaden out from just looking at Israel to kind of looking at Trump and this phenomenon as well, and what some of the things they have in common, even though they have a lot of differences. But they both claim, of course, that they were persecuted by the media and challenge and demonize independent media. That's certainly come up in the trials this week of Netanyahu. And they're kind of want to weaken the checks on their power, the democratic checks on their power. I wrote a book on Israeli prime ministers, including one on Netanyahu. And they both lack emotional intelligence, right? They don't really value, they aren't sensitive to relationships and trust in relationships. And aren't sensitive to that, and to varying degrees, Netanyahu and Trump, and they both are habitual liars, right? And that's why, that's one of the things when we look at the probability of one coalition forming versus another, arguably, and we'll ask Alon what he thinks, that Gantz was burned a little bit, perhaps, by trusting Netanyahu in some ways, as others have been. So maybe Bennett won't join Netanyahu because he can't trust any promises he's going to make, or maybe Saar won't come back because he can't trust any promises Netanyahu is going to make. Both magnify and increase the division in already polarized societies in order to appeal to their base. Both want advisors and ministers who are essentially yes men, and they're suspicious of them and constantly demand complete loyalty. And if they don't get that loyalty, you see the firing of advisors and ministers, which is why his natural allies, Netanyahu, you'd easily be able to form a coalition if Bennett and Saar would have joined him, and those who are on the right would support him and join him, but they don't, because he's made enemies unnecessarily of people that he didn't need to make enemies of, and who ideologically are more similar to him. They, of course, both face legal challenges, even more so for Netanyahu right now, and therefore they conflate kind of their personal interests with the national interests, and both have done that. And they both, interestingly, have shared some of the same people to help them with their campaign. So Aaron Klein, a protege of Steve Bannon, was a strategic advisor for Netanyahu in the March 22 campaign and was his campaign manager for the most recent election. And Corey Lewandowski and David Bosey, former Trump campaign aides, helped the Likud campaign for a month before the March 22 election as well. And US-based pollster John McLaughlin, who worked with Trump during his 220 campaign, is also advising Netanyahu for his March 2021 campaign, right? So here again, I'm just kind of taking a wider lens to start us off with of a kind of trend towards nationalist populist leaders, and certainly between Trump and Netanyahu, even though there are wide differences, some of the commonalities that exist between them and what that decline of these leaders might portend. So as you know, Netanyahu has 26 days to try to form a coalition, but he's in the weakest position he's been. So I think in the last election, he often gets about 28% of the vote. So as many of you know, because I know we have experts on Israeli politics with us today, and we also have students who don't have a strong background. So I'm going to try to form that middle ground for the audience. And so for those of you who don't know, you have lots of parties competing. So no party can ever get over 50% like in the US. So often you think, oh, Netanyahu has been in power 12 years. Most Israelis must love him to have kept in power so long. But that's not the case, right? He often doesn't get maximum 30% of the vote. And it's gone to 25% in this particular election, where he's actually lost 300,000 votes compared to the last election, and he's lost 6 seats, Knesset seats, from a year ago. So in fact, his popularity has decreased. And in some Likud bastions in the periphery, he's lost votes. He dropped 3 seats to Gideon Sa'ar, so the New Hope party that has kind of split off because they're so fed up with Netanyahu. He's lost seats to them, and he's lost 2 more seats to Bennett, right, the Yamina party. Again, shifts within the right from Likud to other parties. And in a recent poll, 62% of Israelis said that Netanyahu has either low credibility or very low credibility, right? So just because he's been in office so long doesn't mean the majority of Israelis support him. Quite the opposite, right? So what are other signifiers of his continuing weakness? Well, as many of you know, for months now, there's been weekly demonstrations, sometimes up to 50,000 people demonstrating, primarily on to get Netanyahu out of office. And for those of you who follow Israeli politics, often a lot of you are either reading Haaretz, the more left-leaning, or Jerusalem Post, the more center-right leaning, or you're reading both. But if you were reading them in the last couple of days, both papers in their editorials expressed alarm at Netanyahu's ranting on Monday evening after the trial on Monday, saying that he was undergoing a coup and a witch hunt because of the trial, and then just ranting against judges, the courts, the justice system, the media, again, kind of as a playbook from Trump. So again, he's, people from, and the papers from the right and the left, both were kind of shocked and exasperated by these rants against democratic institutions in Israel. And only 3 parties now, besides his own party, support him. Shas, United Toward Judaism, and Religious Zionism. So they're all kind of religious parties, and he's kind of a 9 seat short. He's tried everything he could possibly do to divide the opposition while merging parties that might support him. So he actually encouraged, last election, the extreme right party, kind of blatantly racist party, wasn't able to pass the 3.5% threshold. And he actually encouraged kind of a unity and merging between the Bezalel Smotrich's Religious Zionism party, the anti-Arab Otzma Yehudit party, and the anti-LGBT Noam party, so they could pass the electoral threshold, which they did this time. And they are kind of blatantly racist. I think just today, Smotrich was talking about, if Palestinians aren't loyal, they should leave, and just really heinous things to say. But ironically, after encouraging them to merge, he actually lost possibly votes to them, and they might block him from forming a coalition, right? Because they refuse to sit in a coalition with the Ram party chairman, Mansour Abbas, even if he supports from the outside, right? And as Alon will probably talk about, some of the younger ultra-Orthodox, voted for this religious Zionist party as well, rather than the ultra-Orthodox parties, which gave them enough to vote on. So this was kind of a sign of Netanyahu's desperation that he would, normally, I don't think he would want a party like that to be in his coalition. And he was so desperate to survive so that he wouldn't have to continue being prime minister while he's on trial, that he actually encouraged the formation of this party. Now, despite his weakness, his blatant weakness, he may succeed in forming a coalition, right? Lapid was quick to say this week, I call on all the parties that promised Israeli citizens change. Netanyahu will do everything in his power to divide us. He will seek deserters. He will seek to dismantle parties. Don't let him. He has no majority, right? And that's exactly what he's doing right now, is trying to provide incentives for people to defect from the other parties, as he somewhat successfully did after the last election, right? So he offered Amar from Israel Beitenu, oh, you'll be on our list for Likud the next 2 rounds of elections, and you'll get a senior ministerial portfolio. Didn't work. He didn't come to Likud. He offered, apparently, and Alon probably knows more about this, members of the Blue and White Party to break off and join him, and they have refused. And he apparently also has recently offered New Hope's Ifat Shasha Biton, the number 2 on their party slate, the education ministry in the next government, which apparently she was also offered by her own party, New Hope. So he's really trying very hard to offer ministerial positions, offer all kinds of incentives for people to defect. And that's one way that he might be able to cobble down a coalition, or if, of course, our Bennett or others decide to join him. But he certainly may not succeed, and Lapid is hard at work, and it's possible that he'll be able to form a coalition. He has already made a huge concession, so that even though he has 17 seats and Bennett only has 7 seats from the Yamina party, he's offered him to be prime minister first and Lapid to rotate and be prime minister second, which is a huge concession. So we'll see if Bennett goes for it, or whether he's too concerned about his reputation as a right politician if he does so. But at least theoretically speaking, 8 parties have said they'd be willing to join Lapid, and that's Kahol Lavan, the Blue and White, Yamina, Labor, Israel Beitenu, Meretz, New Hope, and the United Arab List. So some of those have not supported him yet, like the Sao's party, which is why Netanyahu is getting the first shot. But they certainly haven't completely rejected the possibility of joining him either. And maybe Alon can tell us something about this too, but there's probably a very, 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 very outside possibility that Gantz maybe could rotate to his next prime ministership, depending on when next elections would be, and his rotation would be up. It seems very unlikely, but maybe it's still possible. I want to quickly go through with you the implications for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, or any progress in it, depending on what coalition is formed. And I'm kind of sad to say that I don't think it'll make a dramatic difference whether we have a Netanyahu coalition in this respect, or a coalition in which Bennett starts off as the prime minister, and that you probably will get kind of more or less a continuance of the status quo, even though sadly, you never actually have a static status quo, right? Things are either getting better or they're getting worse. So if they're not getting better, they may be getting worse. So that's, you wouldn't expect with either of these kind of coalitions any kind of dramatic initiatives and change, unfortunately. But on the positive side, they may all still have a relative consensus on expanding normalization with other states, trying to support the Jordanian government and improving that relationship, keeping good relations with the Biden administration. So in a sense, maybe they'll keep things from getting significantly worse. You won't get that unilateral annexation, perhaps, that we feared we might get a year ago. There also, if we do get Palestinian elections on May 22nd for the first time in about 15 years, it's probably likely that they'll all respond relatively similarly to that prospect. If Hamas were to gain in relative power, they would all express deep concern about that, no matter which coalition was formed, but perhaps you'd see a difference in kind of tone and severity of the criticism, whether it was Netanyahu or whether it was kind of Lapid in the future. In terms of implications for the US-Israeli relations, I also don't expect any dramatic changes depending on what coalition is formed in this respect. Of course, if Lapid were to be prime minister, and definitely if ever the unlikely scenario that Gantz would be, there would be better relations than if it were Netanyahu or Bennett as the first prime minister in terms of settlements, right? So, we just heard this week about a possible expansion of Hama settlements, and certainly under Bennett or Netanyahu, that's always a risk. But I wouldn't expect any kind of dramatic ruptures of relationship, and Biden will try to keep things probably in a quieter level. So since I'm always tried to be an optimist, let me conclude with two possible silver linings to this uncertainty that we're living in. And one may be that even though in certain respects you wouldn't see a dramatic difference between either coalition that's formed, in terms of religious secular issues, and I think Alan Tao will expand on this, you might see a real dramatic difference, whether you see a Netanyahu government with ultra-Orthodox parties and or religious Zionism, or even an Islamist party on one hand, or on the other hand, a Lapid-Bennett government with no religious parties, you're certainly going to see a significant possible differences in terms of, in the latter, in a Lapid-Bennett perhaps government, really continuing to restrict or starting to restrict more the monopoly of the ultra-Orthodox in society, especially with the increased resentment over their schools being open during the pandemic and things like that. And it also speaks, if it is the case that some of the younger ultra-Orthodox actually voted for this real extreme religious Zionism, it kind of speaks, if we had a Lapid-Bennett government, to the need for real curricular reform and mandates for the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. There are all kinds of economic reasons to do so that we know about, that they would need to learn more math and English and science, but also in terms of civic democracy and tolerance, perhaps, if some of them are voting for this party, there would be a real need and something constructive that could be done in terms of curriculum and education in a Lapid-Bennett government. And then secondly, I'll end with, and this is something that Professor Ellie Rekhess will talk more about, is that certainly I think you could have a significant impact, right, in terms of garnering greater legitimacy for Arab parties to join a coalition government, which they've never been in a coalition government before. But you see both on the right and on the left now, much greater legitimacy for doing so than we had even a few months ago, when there was great disappointment that Arab parties were not invited or included as much as they had hoped in negotiations for a coalition government. And that might be one of many contributing reasons why you had a 20% lower voter turnout among Arab Israelis this time around. But in the long term, no matter what happens in terms of the particular coalition this month or next month, that could be huge and could be positive, this greater legitimacy that's given to including Arab parties in the coalition. And it could allow the next time around, if you actually do get a center-left party being able to form a government and that they're willing to include Arab parties, that could make the difference in the continued stagnation between the right bloc and the center-left bloc in Israeli politics. If you have a legitimacy for Arab parties to join the center-left coalition and they're able to, that could be a game changer in future elections. And so that's something to look to. And I think Ellie Rekhess will talk to us more about. So Professor Tao, I hand it to you with all your inside information and all your activity in these campaigns. So thank you so much for joining us from Israel today. You're muted.
Great to be here, Yael. And it's very, very perhaps discouraging to be at a second election panel within the period of a short time, but it does reflect a certain reality, a certain pathology in Israel. I'd like to start by saying that one could argue, as Yael more or less laid it out, that there were some very good things, or these are the best of times and these are the worst of times. But I want to start by saying this was the strangest of times. I've been in several election campaigns and maybe 4 different parties over the years. But doing an election campaign at a time when most of the campaign took place during a lockdown, the last lockdown, during which time many Israelis were becoming vaccinated, but it was a surge and they closed the country down, meant that almost all the usual kind of campaign activities and events didn't take place until the very, very end, and then almost in a symbolic way. So this was very much a Zoom campaign. Israelis are very, very connected. I think Benny Gantz said he did something like 700 Zoom events from the beginning of the campaign to the end, just going from one to the other. Every party set up sort of a fancy schmancy sort of a studio where you could broadcast from and see people and make it feel like that you were actually in a room. And as a candidate and somebody who was in many was kind of comfortable, because usually when I think about running for Knesset, it means, well, I give my wife a kiss goodbye at the beginning of the campaign and I say hi to her the night of the election when I collapse into the chair in the living room to watch results at 10 p.m. Wasn't that way this year. I was sitting in my office just like I am now, talking to all kinds of people. The young technocrats in our party were trying to help me make a blue screen and back saying blue and white, make them think, but it was basically sitting at home and talking to them. I had the fortunate advantage to be in charge of the sustainability campaign for the blue and white party, which means that early on, even while we still had a lockdown, we were sort of sneaking out and having because I was working with a minister and he had access to places, and we would go visit, environmental conflict sites. And so I did get out a little bit, but that was sort of anomalous. So that was sort of bizarre. Television almost was not a factor. In other words, when I was first in Israel, television advertisements were huge. I don't think anybody even knew. It was all done through clever or less clever WhatsApp messages, and Facebook made a fortune in Israel, as they do every election and the like. Now, the other thing that was bizarre about the election, if you ask me, was that the issues, there really weren't that many issues, because when you'd go on these campaign panels, and there's, high schools had them, every day you go 4 or 5 different high schools, you have 300-400 kids in 11th and 12th grade, most of whom are voting or their parents vote. And you'd start talking about things and you realize that, just like Yael said, many things, almost all the parties agree about. Like, we're going to legalize cannabis. That's an issue that everybody seems to agree with. Climate change, which was something which I brought up, but everybody was bringing it up. And in fact, there was almost an inflation. Who can say that they're going to do more renewable energy by 2040, which is a good thing. But it does reflect that. Peace, also, there's new peace agreements. Everybody's for those new peace agreements, and nobody wants to talk about the Palestinians. That was literally across the board. Even Meretz didn't really play that issue up at all. The only area where I would say there was a perhaps potential controversy, or you could point to it, is this issue of LGBTQ rights, which has become almost a consensus issue. But this year in Israel, there were 2 parties who were very open in their, I should put, I think, intolerance or, antiquated discrimination visions. And that was actually a Muslim religious party and a Orthodox party, or Jewish party, and that was sort of peculiar. But in all other issues, you really didn't have it. Things like, you'd think that this election would have been about Corona and how the government mismanaged it. But Bennett tried to do stuff with that, and he kept dropping in the polls from 17 down to 6 eventually, to 7 seats eventually. So that was not anything that got any traction. Poverty, at the peak of the COVID crisis, 25% of Israelis were unemployed. And the government made some stupid mistakes in terms of the way they gave out unemployment benefits. But people weren't really interested in talking about that. So what were they just talking about? Well, just what Yael was saying. They were interested in talking about yes, Bibi, or no, Bibi. So as somebody who was in a party who had joined the Benyamin Netanyahu government in what they called I guess you could call it a symmetrical agreement. In Hebrew, they call it the pariteti. But basically, the way it was set up was that no substantive decisions could be made by one party without the agreement of the other. And so much of what we did for the last year as the Blue and White Party was to keep Benjamin Netanyahu in check. When Donald Trump offered him the opportunity to have unilateral annexation, our party said, no, you can't do that, because we didn't agree to it. And that was managed to stop that. When they tried to make legislation that would limit the Supreme Court's judicial review power, we said, no, you can't do that. When they wanted to make laws which said you can't go demonstrating because we have a pandemic on our hands, we said, no, you can't do that. That's something we're going to allow, even though it has public health implications. And a long list of things that we managed to stop them at. And as a party who had been basically eulogized at the start of, and so much so that when Soon after the campaign began, 120 senior officers, including 2 chiefs of staff of the Israeli army, Ehud Barak, a former prime minister amongst them, called on Benny Gantz, who was the leader of the opposition, or the leader of the alternative to Bibi plan, had at one point got 35 seats, which is a huge achievement for a first-time politician in the second election. And they called him to step down, that he was taking votes away from the center-left bloc, and everybody had to get behind Lapid. And our polls showed at the time that there were a lot of people who would never vote for Lapid. He's got some negatives. I think he's a very talented politician, but many Israelis, for whatever reason, have bought into the demonization, which has been, I think, a process towards him. In any event, our party stuck into it, and the way that we survived, I think, well, we ran a very successful campaign. I mean, we had people sort of dismissive of it, but last week when we went from 3.5, 4 seats, almost not passing the threshold, to getting to 8 seats, we had a lot to do with that. And we weren't the only party, but I want to say that the one thing that came out of the present election discussions is that Israel lacks a major alternative to the Likud bloc. Likud got 30 seats, and the next biggest bloc is 17. But there are many, many parties that are small to mid-size, 6, 7, or 8. And all those parties, at some point during the election, faced the prospects of maybe not getting 3.5%, which means that your votes are not counted at all, and all those votes are lost. And thus began what we call in Hebrew, I think it's actually Yiddish, the phenomenon of the Gemvault Campaign, which originally was one that was done mostly by the Meretz party, which is always tottering above the threshold level. They said, if you don't vote for us, we're going to disappear. So don't vote for Labor, or don't vote for another party, because you don't want to lose those votes from the bloc. But everybody was doing it. The Ram party, the Muslim moderate party, was doing it. At the end of the final poll before the elections in Israel, there's a law that says after the Thursday, we vote always on a Tuesday, because the Bible is, says in the creation story that there was Paimaim Kitov, twice was there. So there's a prohibition on making polls after Thursday. But the final poll said that the 4 parties were in danger of disappearing altogether, and all of them did much, much better than that because of the so-called Gewalt phenomenon. And I think that there was none that was more effective than that of the blue and white, which we had a name for it. We called it the conspiracy of March. And we had a lot of money because we were a large party. And I think people got the message that if the blue and white party was to disappear, the very day after the elections, Benyamin Netanyahu would fire all the ministers, because there's a legal basis to being able to do that if they're not members of Knesset. He would fire all the blue and white ministers, and then would begin to whittle away at the judicial independence of our Supreme Court, and of course try to get his own trial canceled, as he's tried to do on several occasions. So that kind of a campaign worked to some extent. And then the other aspect of the blue and white campaign, which brought us back to life, I would say, was the calling this an election over character, integrity, and honesty. And basically our campaign was, vote Benny, the honest choice. And the last week, the last 4 or 5 days, that seemed to have been very, very compelling. I know literally dozens of people said after all was done, I was very disappointed that he joined Bibi Netanyahu. I was really sorry to see how he was taken advantage of and his decency, whatever, but at the end of the day, I have to vote for somebody who's honest. So that was something that worked. But it wasn't only the blue and white campaign, which you could say was sort of resurrected from the dead. This election goes down as the comeback for the Labor Party, Israel's Labor Party, which is the same party, which is, I think, historically, we can attribute them the creation of the state of Israel. The same people gave us the Haganah and the Palmach and David Ben Gurion, were basically erased, no longer even appearing as somebody who passes a threshold in all the polls until Merav Michaeli took over. She was the only woman to head a party, and that certainly didn't hurt her. A lot of women decided to vote for Labor because it's about time that there be a little bit more women running political parties. But she's a very good speaker, a good communicator, a woman with, I think, integrity. Her celebrity boyfriend or partner is a talk show host who's very clever, and people kind of think they have a neat relationship. She's so much older, about 10 years older than him anyway. And so the Labor Party made a big comeback too. And I think these are good news. These are voices we'd like to have on the political scene. But what it means is having all these mid-sized parties means there's no single alternative. And in the last 2-3 days, when we tried to see how the president might pick an alternative to Bibi as to lead, try to form the coalition, I think it turned out to be a negative. I did want to say one or two words. I know that Ellie will speak to the issue of the Arab sector, which is a very complicated and fascinating transition. But let's say a little bit about the religious community, because this was an interesting phenomenon which didn't exist in another one. Yael mentioned that because in past elections, the far right had never passed the threshold, Bibi Netanyahu literally sold his soul to the devil and decided that he was going to personally see to it that all these far right, somewhat extremist parties, some of them racist, would be together in a block so that all those votes together would collectively be sufficient to pass the threshold, and was successful. In fact, so successful that a party became actually have 6 votes. But what happened along the way was that the ultra-Orthodox, who've always had, I think, an extremely loyal electorate, many of the young ultra-Orthodox people who clearly were frustrated by the way their community had run the COVID crisis and the remaining of schools open, and felt that there had been any number of complaints against them, many of them voted for this party. It was the first time you see ultra-Orthodox who were, at least according to the stereotype, anti-Zionists voting for hyper-Zionist parties that are ultra-nationalist and the like. So, for example, 13% of Mea Shearim, sort of the epicenter of ultra-Orthodox Judaism, voted for this religious Zionism party. I think over 50% of the Kfar Chabad, the Lubavitcher Hasidism. I'm very good friends with a friend of mine who's a Haredi politician. He says, don't try to understand Israeli ultra-Orthodox politics by the United States. But in Israel, the Chabad is the most right-wing, and some people would say racist, of the ultra-Orthodox factions, and they voted heavily for Bezalel Smotrich and the far-right party. So those are some of the more interesting phenomena. I want to try to wrap it up here because I'm done with almost my 20 minutes. I would say the one thing I think that many Israelis are reaching the conclusion is that we are in desperate need of electoral reform. There's something not working in the system. And although I felt very comfortable campaigning for a party who could legitimately look Israelis in the eye and said, we literally stopped with our bodies and votes the Likud from implementing what we think to be a very dark and anti-democratic agenda, that's not exactly what you want from a party. You want a party to say, this is what I did. And I think that the certain sense of paralysis, at least on many issues, now, if you're on the left, you might say, well, that's a good thing, because if there wasn't paralysis, Israel certainly shifted to the right, and we might have things like unilateral annexation. But I think in the long term, it's not healthy. And there's one other thing I wanted to say that was different about this election, the past one, and that was Joe Biden. I think the Biden phenomenon, first of all, gave some people in the center left hope that you can get rid of a sort of a right-wing, somewhat, you could argue, despotic or charismatic, kind of political figure. And the fact that there was a sense that the truth of the matter is that the right-wing agenda probably will not really be able to be implemented over the next 4 years, because the United States will intervene and use its moral suasion or use the manipulative powers that it has to keep Israel in line, something that was not the case during the Trump administration. So all these things lead to a different outcome. And now we're facing a situation where we have to see whether or not Netanyahu will be able to form a coalition. And if not, I think in the second, hopefully there'll be a second round when Yair Lapid will be able to put together a government. I expect that we'll start seeing, I think we will see a government this time. I don't think we're going to go to a 5th round of elections. And but stay tuned. I mean, we've proven that Israel's far less predictable politically than we would have liked it to be, and that maybe we still have what to learn. So that's my opening comments, and over to you, Ellie.
I'll thank you so much, Professor Tao, both for your academic insights and also your insider insights in terms of working on the campaign through all these elections. So Professor Ellie Rekhess was with us the day MSU closed. I think he was on the plane a year ago when MSU decided everything was closed. We didn't know what to do. We kind of decided to, oh, you're already here, we'll do it in person. And I think, but had our first live stream. And so most people watched you who weren't in person, while a dozen person came in person. And here we are a year later, and see what your reflections are. Ellie Rekhess is the director of Israel Innovation Project at Northwestern University, which develops academic ties between Northwestern and Israeli universities with special emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and math. He holds the position of the Crown Visiting Professor in Israel Studies at Northwestern since 2013 and teaches in Jewish Studies and in History. And in 2014, he established Israel Studies at the Crown Family Center for Jewish Studies and Israel Studies, and was appointed their Associate Director for Israel Studies, a position he held until August 2020. Professor Rekhess is a leading historian of the contemporary Middle East and specializing in the study of the Arab minority in Israel and Islamic resurgence within the Palestinian society. He authored and edited over a dozen books related to his fields of interest, and his most recent book was entitled Muslim Minorities and Non-Muslim Majority States. He served as a strategic advisor to my Prime Minister Ehud Barak and as advisor to the Ministerial Committee on the Arabs in Israel. And until his retirement in 2011, not retirement in terms of retirement in terms of forced retirements at a certain age in Israel, he taught at the Department of Middle East History at Tel Aviv University. So he's one of kind of, I'd say, the world experts on the subject to provide us insights in terms of the elections, but especially the important vote for Arabs in Israel and their influence.
Thank you. Thank you, Yael. And I deeply apologize for being late, I guess. I had to turn myself into two parts, two pieces, because of misunderstanding regarding the Eastern time, the Central time, the Western time. I got all mixed up, and luckily I caught myself in the last moment to understand that I'm going to miss all of this session. So luckily we got it in the last moment, and I managed to be here. I hope I'm the third in line, right? Yael, you spoke, and Alon, I spoke, so it's fine. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about the Arab vote, which is really the hot potato of all this. My stocks went up. I remember a personal comment, if I may. When I started my studies many years ago in Middle Eastern studies, I said I want to study the Arab minority in Israel. And my professor, who was Professor Shimon Shamir, some of you may recall the name, said, "What are you dealing with the Israeli Arabs? Take something serious, biteable, that you can bite into. Take Egypt, take Syria, take Lebanon, take something serious." And I said, "No, I want to take the Israeli Arabs." And so many years later, now I see that it is seriously a topic to be dealing with. So anyway, the results of the elections in the Arab sector indeed represent a major upheaval in the Jewish Arab political scene in Israel. They have shaken both the inner Arab landscape and, more importantly, in an unprecedented way, the general Israeli political setting. I will not go into the reasons why the turnout in the Arab sector plummeted so dramatically, and why the Arab electorate support for the Joint Arab List, the JAL, plunged. What I want to focus on today is the sea change that occurred in Israeli politics, namely the legitimization, the so-called legitimization of the Arab vote, and the partial acceptance of the Arab parties as equal partners in government coalitions. We'll see. And let me start with some historical perspectives. Since the establishment of the State of Israel, Arab political parties have been traditionally excluded from government coalitions. Zionist parties have never considered Arab parties as legitimate partners, mostly because of the Arabs' anti-Zionist views and their critical outlooks of official Israeli policies. Today, this paradigm of exclusion begins to crack and gradually be dissolved. Now, the background to this change lies both in the crisis within the Jewish political scene in recent years and the transformations that occurred in Arab politics. Now, as you know, repeatedly, the election outcomes in Israel in recent years have produced in an almost equal balance between the right and the center left, without either having the ability to build sustainable coalitions of 61 seats based on Jewish parties only. As a result, the Arab parties have grown in importance as tiebreakers. Concurrently, on the Arab side, the mainstream in Arab politics has gradually begun to endorse what is referred to in the professional literature as the Israelization concept, namely a concept that calls for greater integration in the country's political and social life. This does not mean abandoning the Palestinian element in the national identity. It was coupled with a strong, uncompromising commitment to the Palestinian cause, a process that came to be known as Palestinization, which I had the dubious honor of coining. This duality of Palestinization and Israelization was embodied in the platform of the United Arab List, the joint United Arab List. Now, a change occurred in the 2020 elections. After a prolonged internal debate, the Joint Arab List moved away from this equilibrium when they expressed willingness to support a Jewish candidate as prime minister, namely Benny Gantz. But the center-left rejected the Arab hand and gave them a cold shoulder. What I argue is that it was Benyamin Netanyahu, Bibi, that helped engineer this disentanglement between the Arabs and the center-left in a well-thought strategy to alienate the Arabs from the center-left. In the first stage of his plan, he initiated in 2015 an aggressive campaign of delegitimization of the Arabs in order to drive a wedge between the Israeli political left and the Arabs. Remember his famous declaration that, quote, the Arab voters are running to the ballots in droves. Second stage of his plan, and trust me, I'm not a disclaimer, I'm not a Bibi supporter, but this is the way I analyze. He's a great political strategist, maybe one of the biggest and the greatest that Israel has had in recent years. So the second stage was to embrace the Arab public in a kind of a reverse flanking move, which served, of course, his own Likud party. The main tool was Plan 922, a 5-year plan of unprecedented size, 10 billion shekels for the economic development of the Arab society. Now, in the third stage, during this very recent election campaign, he identified a major factor which was working in his favor. And this is the internal division, fragmentation, factionalism within the Arab political entity. Taking advantage of this factor, Netanyahu succeeded to disintegrate the Joint Arab List and established an unwritten alliance, the first of its kind, with Mansour Abbas, head of Ra'am, the UAL, the United Arab List, one of the 4 parties which constitute the Joint Arab List. The United Arab List, Reshima Mishutefet, split, and UAL, headed by Abbas Mansour, decided to run independently. Mansour Abbas, deputy head of the Islamic movement in Israel, in an, again, unprecedented move, seemed to have agreed with Netanyahu, at least clandestinely, that the latter would commit to improve the socio-economic lot of the Arab sector. In return, the UAL might be ready, and I'm very careful with my wording, either to join a Netanyahu-led coalition to provide him with the necessary 61-member Knesset majority, or afford him support from the outside as an obstruction bloc. As a result, Bibi, or Abu Yair, as he came to be known, indeed has been vigorously campaigning in the Arab sector, in the Negev, in the Triangle, in the Galilee, declaring that his government will stop violence. He frequently visited the vaccination center and so forth and so forth. encouraging direct vote for the Likud and indirect support for Abbas. Now, we need not be naive and believe that Bibi underwent a metamorphosis. It was the extra votes of the Arabs and the potential support of Abbas that he hoped would enable him to set up a government. Defining expectations. Am I good with time, Yael? Oh, I can't hear you.
Yeah, you have another 8 minutes if you.
Whether I'm good or not, I will finish my talk. I had to cut a very important meeting and I'm not going to give up on my talk.
Okay.
I'm joking. Defying expectations, Abbas managed to pass the election threshold and won 4 Knesset seats, receiving almost 40% of the vote, and thus emerged as a possible kingmaker after the inclusive elections, maneuvering himself to the very center of Israel's political stage. In a rare primetime conciliatory address in Hebrew, Abbas called for Arab-Jewish cooperation in Israel, urging Jewish parties not to boycott him, and not committing himself either to support Netanyahu or the other part. What is Abbas's outlook? Let's try to have a closer look at what he thinks. Abbas represents, in his political outlook, a deep commitment to the principle of practical pragmatism. True, he's not the first one to do so. Ayman Odeh of the JAL coupled social struggle with for equality with political national campaign, Israelization alongside Palestinization. Abbas, on the other hand, offers a formula of a different kind. Let's highlight the socio-economic issue and subside, reduce the centrality of the national cause. Notably, absent from Abbas's speech was any mention, direct reference to the Palestinian cause. Now, I believe that Abbas made an excellent observation in reading the minds, the sentiments of the Arab public in Israel today, and in particular of the rising middle class of the Arab public in Israel. Let me share with you the following data. In a recent survey held just a while ago, 64% of the interviewees, the Arab interviewees, said that they believed it was desirable for the Arab parties to be in any governing coalition, not just that of a center left. So he knew to read, he read the map correctly. And what is the essence of this change then? With his visionary speech, Abbas seems to be marking a historic turning point. While Arab citizens are already part of the legislative and the judicial branches, they were entirely absent from the executive branch. Now, for the first time, the opportunity to be part of the executive becomes more realistically. It could well mean the full legitimization of participation by elected representative of the Arab community in the coalition game and the decision-making process. These are new trends that were unimaginable not too long ago. And what is so important in this process that it is the Likud, it is Abu Yair who brought this about. Remember the slogan, Rak HaLikud Yachol. Only the Likud can bring peace with Egypt during Begin's time. So we hear Tzachi Hanegbi says, oh yes, why not? What's wrong with Abbas? David Bitan, the spokesman for Bibi says, well, what's wrong? At times one needs to compromise. David Bitan, can you imagine? And so forth and so forth. So far, so good. However, there are some obstacles and constraints, and I'm getting towards the end of my presentation, Yael. There is duality in the United Arab List. Not everything is rosy as one may think, and those who have listened to me until now. The United Arab List, Ra'am, represents a party based on dual policies. On the one hand, it is a pragmatic, as I said, political party who knew how to mold pragmatism into a policy that brought them 4 seats. Pragmatic party which seeks to integrate into the general Israeli polity and achieve socio-economic benefits for the Arab society in Israel. But concurrently, Ra'am is part of the southern faction of the Islamic movement in Israel. And let's not forget that. It is a conservative movement, seeks to preserve the traditional nature, Islamic nature of the Arab society, to maintain the norms and values of Islamic society, to fight what it considers the corruptive standards of modernity. It is vigorously anti-gay. It traces its roots to the Muslim Brotherhood. True, its founder, Sheikh Abdullah Nimr Darwish, was a leading figure in Jewish-Arab coexistence. His policy was community-oriented. He set up building, daycares, kindergarten, clinics, and so forth and so forth. He channeled Islamic activity towards municipal domain and the Knesset. And unlike the northern faction of the Islamic movement, the southern faction of Abbas avoids harsh radical Islamic policies. The charter is mild, but it still calls for the return to Al-Aqsa and so forth. But we have to remember, if Ra'am becomes a coalition partner, it will definitely have to walk a very difficult tightrope. How would it react when a decision will be needed to be taken on an attack on Gaza? What will they do? Will they walk out of the room? This is one major constraint. The other major constraint is opposition from the right. Politics make strange bedfellows, goes the saying. But in our case, the challenge is indeed difficult to overcome. A major issue is the staunch opposition of right-wing parties to any collaboration with Abbas. Otzma Yehudit, headed by Ben Gvir and his supporters, have ruled out basing a coalition on Ra'am support due to what they say is an anti-Zionist stance and its support of terrorists. Ben Gvir, forgot his first name. You remember? Whatever. Not a name to be recalled, was quick to respond to Abbas' speech, accusing him of playing cute teddy bear while sanctifying infant killers. So what do you do?
Itamar Ben-Gvir.
Itamar, well, great name. Thank you. And finally, and this is my last point, there is Abbas' shopping list. Abbas is no fool. He emerges as a very, very smart and sophisticated politician. Any deal he will be making or striking with either Bibi or someone else, and we don't know because there is a deadlock. He will be presenting a shopping list with a very, very high list. He will need to deliver to his voters and justify the dramatic vote. And such a list is a dramatic list. Changes in the controversial Jewish nation-state law, eradication of organized crime and violence in Arab communities, an issue that preoccupies the Arab community, elimination of the 2017 Kamenetz law, which stiffens penalties for illegal constructions, significant additional budgets for the Arab municipality as key issues, reform in planning and constructions, expanding jurisdiction boundaries, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. So it's not only the question of money, of funneling more and more money to the Arab sector. How does one handles all this ball game? I don't know. But the important thing that these elections will be remembered, in my humble understanding, as a turning point in both the internal Arab political scene and in the more general landscape of Israeli politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that is a ray of hope and possibly having long-term kind of legitimacy for what was unthinkable, like you said, just a little while ago. We have 5 questions. So I'll start off with 2 for you, Professor Rekhess. One is from Alan Gale. It says, please comment on the plummeting of the Arab vote percentage. And another, that you said Netanyahu was a great political strategist in terms of how he was handling the Arab parties and the Jewish center left and pitting them against each other. But the attendee is saying, is he really a strategist? Or is he just kind of making these tactical short-term decisions in order to survive another round, but he doesn't really have any long-term kind of grand strategy? So is he just a scrappy survivor? Although there might be unintended long-term effects to his giving legitimacy to bringing Arab parties in. So those 2 questions for you.
Well, thank you for your questions. And thank you for welcoming me, even though I was late. Number one, who said that the 2 are mutually exclusive? A great politician can be both a good tactician, you could say, and a strategist. The combination of the 2 really works well. And I think indeed he is. He's a tactician on the day-to-day level and a strategist on the long range level. Look, and again, I'm not a Bibi supporter, but looking back on his foreign policy in the last 10, 11 years, he has made a few significant achievements running the state of Israel. From an economic point of view, I think, again, he has led Israel significantly. Tactically, from a tactic point of view, he has also made a few successful tactical moves. I think he identified what was happening in the Arab sector. He understood that the center-left could not deliver the goods to the Arabs. And indeed so, because traditionally you said, oh, the Arabs were affiliated, or I'm speaking in general terms, the Arab electorate is traditionally affiliating with the center-left, with the Labour Party. What did the Labour? How did they benefit? Did Labour ever include Arabs in a significant way? Yes, there were ministers who were included in Labour government, I should say. Ghaleb Majadle, I think there was a Druze, Salah Tarif, but did they have any practical effect on the lot of the Arabs? Very little so. So I think the power and the influence of Netanyahu is conceived, at least by the Arabs, as much bigger and of that. And look what happened to the left, to the center left. Look at the results of the elections, the voting. if I may, and I'll be short. You know how much votes did Labor receive during this election? It's embarrassing. 0.9% of the Arab vote went to the Labor Party. This is the glamorous Labor Party that in the 50s, alongside with the Arab satellite list, received nearly 70, maybe 75% of the Arab vote. 0.9. How shameful. They went to nothing. And Meretz, okay, Meretz got 3.7%. The representation of Arab Knesset member, Meretz got 2 Arab seats, I should say to their credit. But all the rest, Likud got 5.2%. Again, Bibi had hoped for more. This didn't get Bibi even a 1 mandate. But Labor, I keep looking at this figure and I'm stunned, 0.9%. Okay, so this is as far as Bibi's strategies. What was the other question?
I think the other question is if you can elaborate on the reasons for
the reason for
the
yes,
drop in voting. And then
drop.
since we're on the subject, I'll throw 2 more in for both of you that are associated from this. So one is from Samuel Feldberg, regards from Brazil, to Professor Rekhess. How does the Arab minority react? How did they react to the Abraham Accords in spite of no advance in the Palestinian issue? And maybe since we're on this kind of general subject, I'll kind of throw into Alan Tao, to the degree that you feel comfortable talking about it, kind of if you can go into kind of Gantz's thinking of kind of his reluctance to maybe bring in the Arab parties when he was kind of trying to form a coalition last time around, and whether he's drawn any kind of lessons going forward in terms of that area or others, kind of expand it, and then we'll move to maybe some other questions in the Q&A.
I'll let Alon take over.
One of the clear, I think, shifts that's happening amongst Israeli Arab citizens is I would say, a distancing from the Palestinian Arab identity and interests. It's difficult to generalize, and there's very different voices. I can only speak perhaps more intuitively and anecdotally from my interaction with my own students. And of course, I did campaign and met many people, including Arab potential voters. But one can clearly see, and this was, when recently Mansour Abbas made his speech to the nation and did not even mention the Palestinians, that this was not by chance. This was a statement that saying, we, perhaps due to the profound disappointment with the Arab Spring or whatever the reasons are, as Israeli Arab citizens are going to double down on our Israeli identity, but insist that we get a better shot at equality and equality of opportunity. And so when the agreements came through with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and afterwards Morocco, and the United Arab list in the Knesset was so dismissive of it, I think it rubbed Israeli Arab citizens, many of them, the wrong way. Because I think this is good news. I mean, for everybody, this is peace. And indeed, I've heard it said, well, basically what's happened in the last year is that the Arab-Israeli conflict has essentially come to an end. We still have a very, very complicated and simmering and explosive Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But having so many influential Arab nations now with real peace agreements with Israel has changed. And I think that Israeli Arabs, who often feel very, very isolated, they would rather fly off to Dubai than to fly to Amman, to take the bus to Amman. It's a funner place to spend time. And I think it's a place which offers some greater opportunity. So I think they are enthusiastic about those agreements on the whole, although perhaps Professor Rekhess has data which can confirm that one way or the other. And I think it does play off in the, in their voting, and the way that they're distancing themselves, and the fact that the United Arab list went down, was it from 14 or 15 seats to 6? That is really perhaps the biggest story that I saw in this election. With regard to Gantz, I just want to make it clear, Benny Gantz was very interested in forming a government with the support of Arab parties in the last election. It was only because two members of his own, wasn't his party, but one of the parties in the coalition, the Telem party, Yoaz Hendel and Tzvika Hausner, were opposed. They said, we will not support you. And they lacked the 2 seats that would have made him over. But if it had been up to Gantz, if they had only towed the party line, there would have been 61 votes and Bibi Netanyahu would not have been the prime minister. It would have been Benny. So I think that's a misapprehension to say that he was unwilling. And in fact, I mean, after the first election, the first time I came and said, Benny, you have to have Arabs in the list. And for 2 times, he sort of froze the list. But this time, of course, the Druze candidate, the woman after me is we have an Arab candidate. So I don't think he has enough representation. I think he could be as effective. Certainly, as Bibi Netanyahu can get 5% of the Arab vote, Benny Gantz should be able to get an equal amount because I think he fundamentally is somebody is more open to it. But I don't think that's going to be the turning point for the Blue and White Party. But surely there was never disqualification, and even now. When we think about forming a new coalition, I would say the jury is not yet in. If we do see a Yair Lapid-led government, I would believe that it would be reliant on Arab support, just as the Rabin government was in the past. But I would defer to Ellie on these particular issues.
I fully agree with you, Alon. And I'm a student of history, and as you spoke, a line came in my mind, and in the 60s, there was a public official called Advisor on Arab Affairs, Yoetz L'Inyanim Aravim, and he was Ben Gurion's advisor on anything that had to do with Arab. At that time, there was a military government until 1965. And he was the person that was in charge of anything that had to do with the Arab minority. And then they coined the term Aravim, Arviyei Israel. That time they called them Arviyei Israel. Now no longer the term is applicable. And you rightly called them Aravim Palestinaim. I should have used the term more often. Would serve as Gesher LeShalom, the peace, the bridge to peace. Now, at that time, Arab national figures ridiculed the term, particularly one Arab poet named Samih al-Qasim, maybe some of you are familiar with the name, who said, don't make us laugh because bridge is something that you step on. And therefore, don't ridicule us and call us a bridge for peace. Now, I'm telling you this because nowadays, as I look at the agreements, the Abraham Accords and other accords, and the peace agreement with Egypt and Jordan, and the ability to travel to Turkey and so forth, I'm beginning to think for the first time, I must say today, that this notion should be reborn and reaffirmed and reapplied, because I always believed that the Arabs in Israel can easily be integrated into the state of Israel. And earlier, I mentioned the middle class briefly. And what I envisage is the rise of a growing in size middle class of Arab citizens in Israel who were born in this country, not this country, I mean in Illinois, were born in Israel, educated in Israel, raised in Israel, studied in Israel, have gained their profession in Israel, and became part of being Israeli just as I am and Alon is and others are, and have their life and are not preoccupied with the Palestinian issue day and night. And I agree with you. And I mentioned this. And Abbas was smart enough to put the Palestinian side aside, put the Palestinian issue aside in his talk. And that's the great opportunity. Now, what will Bibi do with it? I don't know. If he will be smart enough, and if he undergoes a change, he will grasp the opportunity. And if someone else will be Gantz or anybody else, this is the opportunity for a genuine change where we can see the Arabs in Israel become part of this country and a real bridge to our neighbors. And there is great respect in our neighboring countries to the Arab citizens of Israel. And somebody said in an interview the other way, you know, you feel so bad in this country? Okay, you know what? Take your things and move to Gaza City. Spend a week in Gaza City. Spend a week in the Rekhess refugee camp, and then talk. And then see your Popeye behavior, and then come back and see. Of course, I'm saying cynically, and you understand what I mean.
Yeah, obviously we know that you think that's a horrible thing to be saying. The question in terms of why, I think it went down 20% their vote, that someone was asking. I mean, the two explanations I've heard is either kind of disaffection, disalienation from the parties, Jewish parties that don't do anything or don't want them or not doing anything in the communities, but also their own political leaders, right? Those are the two explanations that you see in polls. So I don't know if you could speak to that. And then we have two questions after that from Michal Dan. One is if the US seems less invested in the Middle East, that's for instance, one reason why Biden took a month to call any leader in the Middle East. The Middle East is no longer or isn't his number one priority. And of course, he has other priorities. How will that affect kind of Israeli politics is her question. And then she has a second question. If Israel is so deeply polarized and divided, would there be any possibilities, under what conditions could we even think about the possibility of a civil war? So first, again, our vote, and then those big questions. Yeah.
I just want
Our vote, very quickly, I'll say, and I already alluded to that. The Arab public is fatigued and tired and disenchanted with the Arab politicians. They are sick and tired of the inability of the Arab politicians. At long last, when was it? In 2015, they finally got together and pulled their forces into one unified contingent and established the United Arab List. And the result was amazing. They won 15 Knesset seats and became the third largest political party in the Knesset. This was amazing. And it illustrated how strong and powerful the Arab vote can be if they joined ranks, pulled their ranks together. And for me, as an observer, it was clear that it is only a question of time till this unity will disintegrate. This is the malaise of the Arab society, which is a tribal society, which is divided along endless line of division. And I'm not, when I use the word tribal, I go back to Islamic history, dating back to the very beginning of pre-Islamic history. And these lines draw back to present day. So it's the Galilee divided, is different from the Negev, and the Negev is different from the triangle. And within the triangle, you have the northern triangle and the southern triangle. And in the villages, you have the Hamulas, al-Fahim, which is a huge city of 60,000 inhabitants, if I'm not mistaken, Alon, you should know better. Has 4 major hamulas, each one numbering 15,000, and you have sub-clans within it. And much of the killings, by the way, and much of the violence has to do with crime, of course, and crime families, but much of it is based on hamulas fighting, on clan fightings. So this internal division and fragmentation, and by the way, there is the religious element, and which I forgot to mention, that it's Islam, it's Christianity, it's Druze. The village of Mrar, from where Mansour comes, is a mixed village where horrible things happened there between the Druze and the Christian community a couple of years ago. So the Arab voters said, you know what, enough. We can no longer have this anymore. Finally, we had a unified party, and now you break again. You know what? Leave us alone. Toda Rabba. We stay at home, and the Jewish parties, on the other hand, didn't manage to attract them, because most of the votes of those who voted, 80% went to Arab parties, not to Jewish parties. Kahol Lavan gained only 1% of the Arab vote, 1%.
And we didn't even hardly try. It's funny. I was in Nazareth during the campaign, and it seemed at the time when I talked to people that there was a genuine outrage, because more than one person told me, we created this incredible political power, and what did these political leaders do? They wasted it. They spent all their time talking about Palestinians, knowing that that would disqualify them amongst the Zionist parties, and in so doing, took what could have been a game changer. And here we have real issues of violence, real issues of poverty, real issues of inadequate opportunity. And of course, during the COVID, during the second surge, the first surge, it was lower in the Arab community, was higher in the later ones. And they said, and they basically blew it. And there was a sense of disengagement. I just want to give one figure to back up. And it's a shift that happened. There's a think tank called the Shacharit, is a political think tank in Tel Aviv, and they did a major study on Arab identity, and they said, how would you characterize themselves? And there were four options. It could be either a religious identity, an Arab identity, Israeli identity, or a Palestinian identity. And that's exactly how it went down. 30% said I'm religious, some 25% said I'm an Arab, and about 24% said Israeli, and only 14% said Palestinian. That is a real shift. And I think that, I don't think it's going to go back. I don't think that Israeli Arab citizens would like to be part, exactly what Ellie referred to, that, and they have, of course, sympathy and empathy and hope that the Palestinians get a fair shake. But I think that 70 years of Israeli citizenship has created a different personal identity. And for most Israeli Arab citizens, it's not gonna change. That's,
Let me throw in one more element, Yael, with your permission. The only power, in my humble view, that can bring about unity amongst the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel is the Islamic movement. Now, I know it's bombshell what I'm saying now. Now, of course, there are Christians, there are Druze. We should put them aside. But, and it's not accidental, that it is Mansour Abbas, who is the deputy head of the Islamic movement in Israel. Don't forget that. Other than that, he is a dentist, by the way. That it is him who led into this amazing change, because he has support. We don't have time to, I don't have time to describe what an Islamic movement is. But an Islamic movement has all that a political organization needs to succeed. And a political organization needs three elements in order to succeed. Any political movement, anywhere in the world. You need leadership, you need ideology, and you need organization. If you miss one of these three, you're doomed to fail. So they have a leader, they have an ideology, and not necessarily this pragmatism. They have an ideology, which is the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. And they have organization, which Sheikh Darwish built for years, spread in every village. So remember what I said, and this we go on record, right? Are we on record?
You're on record, yes.
It's recording, so you're locked into it, ready
It's
or not.
good. It's good. I'm proud. Because
I'll go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt you. Are you?
No, this is it. I just want to say.
We have three remaining questions and little time, so maybe I'll pose them and you can pick which one you might want to answer. So one was on the Biden administration kind of not prioritizing the Middle East as much. And, I personally think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict requires active mediation. So that may not, be good, although the normalization agreements might cause something. The second question, and the last question was given all the instability in the Israeli electoral system and governments, wouldn't it be better to raise the threshold to 5 or 10% so that you have fewer parties and perhaps greater stability, right? It used to be that Israel was one of 2 countries in the world with the lowest threshold, right? It was at 1.5% at one point or something. They raised it and eventually to 3.25, but is it still too low? And I know that one of the obstacles, understandably, is all the small parties don't want it to raise because then they'll lose it and they're the ones who are going to be voting on it. So that's certainly a challenge, but we want to hear your opinions on that. And the third one, which was the first question that was posted in Q&A, is did the kind of pandemic increase inequalities and vaccinations increase inequalities in a way in Israel? And how did that affect the election? Let me just quickly make sure I'm getting that question right. Yeah. How has the pandemic exacerbated inequality between rich and poor, and how has that increased inequality reverberated in the elections, if at all? So maybe make your choice as to what you want to tackle in our remaining few minutes.
I can give 3 quick answers to each of them. The first of them is that the Biden administration seemingly, I wouldn't say lackadaisical attitude to Israel, or the fact that it has other priorities, I think it doesn't bode well for peace in the region. I think you're right, without people giving us a kick in the pants. But until the players change, I think that Joe Biden is very aware of the stalemate that he witnessed as Obama tried to make headway, and John Kerry put a lot of energy into it, and nothing came of it. And I don't think that he's going to put good money or good time after bad. And in that sense, I think that, although I think he will rein Israel in if Israel, violates certain, human rights axioms, whatever, I expect that we're going to see unless there's a change in Israeli leadership and Palestinian, they have elections coming up too. I think that's going to stay the same. And I don't think it affected the elections particularly, but that's the thing. With regards to raising the threshold, it's a real dilemma. We live in a country which is a very, very diverse mosaic, and the notion that every small faction should have some person in the Knesset who represents them is a good idea. There's no reason in the world why we should expect that all ultra-Orthodox have to be in the same party, and all flavors of socialist people should be in the party or whatever there. But it creates, I think, at the present time, a deadlock and inability, real questions of ability to rule and governance that are becoming acute. So I would think that maybe the answer might be to leave the legislative branch as it is, but maybe go to more of an American system where the executive branch has greater independence. I mean, in the municipalities where mayors are elected for 5 years and get to rule and basically have a lot of authority, that is increasingly becoming the most effective branch of government, the local government, where things get done because somebody has power and they can make decisions good or bad, and they don't have to be called in all the time. The city councils can only veto a budget. That's the only power they have, and the mayor does what he wants. So I'm not so sure if we had one election where we elected the prime minister separately, I'm not so sure that's a bad way to go if we're thinking about electoral reform. And the last question was about the pandemic. There's no question about it. The ultra-Orthodox community was affected much, much more than the secular community. At the peak of the time, it was percentage-wise 400 or 500% more. There was a period of time there where over 1%, I think, of all ultra-Orthodox Israeli citizens over 65 were dead because of the pandemic. And maybe by Brazilian standards, that's not much, but in Israel, it's a huge number compared to how they were less protected. And as somebody who considers the issue of crowdedness or whatever, initially that we did some surveys, and there's no indication that ultra-Orthodox Israelis, Haredi Israelis were angry about that. But I think in the election, we started to see the cracks that the ultra-Orthodox population is tired of being poorer than the rest of the country. And that when they were locked in, I think it did have a sense that, if we had been connected to the internet, we might have been able to have better information about how to address this. We paid a huge price, and I'm hopeful that this might push not all, but some of the more modern people who are open to a more to integrate better into Israeli society, realizing that they have what to gain in terms of their own income. And I think we see voting patterns for the first time. The Haredi bloc is cracked, and in fact, within their own party, the United Torah Judaism Party, we see that maybe that the so-called Lithuanians and the Hasidic people may be splitting up because they're not getting it going so well. So very interesting things. Maybe in the next election, this time we talked a lot about the Arabs, maybe the ultra-Orthodox will be the the central discussion of the next election. Let's hope it's not too soon.
Any concluding remarks, Ellie? Or
No, regarding the threshold, I don't think we should further raise it, because I think that 3.25 is already a threshold that prevents, is doing its work. I mean, I don't see any infiltration of smaller parties that really affect the political system to a point that they can manipulate, that they have manipulative power to affect the political system. I don't think 4% would do the work. So this is good. The problem is not raising the threshold. The problem is electoral reform, as Alon said, that would get us out of the system that, for the fourth time we're in the tie and nothing happens. And more and more people now are talking, as from what I hear, about a fifth round, because we are in the tie and nothing happens. So the question is an electoral reform and not raising the threshold. Number one, the Biden administration, I think we are in an interim period. Definitely things have changed as far as foreign policy. I'm not an expert on that, and I'm just following as anybody else. They're waiting to see, they're waiting to set up their own priorities, which are different from the previous administration, undoubtedly so. But I think they're also waiting to see what's happening on the Israeli side, which government we're going to see and what kind of a government. But whichever government will reign Israel, they will have to take into account that someone else is sitting in the White House, and this new gentleman has different thought than the previous one. And finally, the pandemic. The pandemic has affected the Israeli scene significantly. I agree with you, Alon, not only with regarding to the Haredi society, but generally so. People, the Israeli society was deeply affected economically, socially. People have lost their jobs and have not recovered yet. Even though life is gradually coming back to normal, people need to recuperate. People need to come out of financial disasters. And this is not a government that comes with open arms and say, come to me, I will provide you help. I have plans, I have programs, I have aids, I have money to, no, this is not the case. And I think it has affected a whole generation economically. And furthermore, there's another point here. A whole stratum of children missed a year of education in their life. They were sitting in front of monitors, and they were speaking to monitors for years. Now, you figure out what it is. And by the way, this is not only in Israel, this is worldwide. But I'm talking about the Israeli case. And they were confused. One day they were going back to school, and one way they were not going to school. There was no consistent policy. There was confusion. We had 15 czars, and each one said something different. You would listen to the news, and horrible. And there is a price for it. Maybe when will the price will be paid? I don't know. In 1 year, in 2 years, maybe in 5 years. So the damage has been done, and it's bad. I'm sorry, I have to.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Many of you have joined us for a fourth time in the past 2 years. So whatever it is, Israeli politics is never boring, although it can be frustrating, and to have all these elections, and frustrating if things are going to the direction we want, or there's kind of challenges to democracy and stagnation with many policies. We have seen also opportunities for great change from this election, whether it's breaking the taboo, which could be huge, of having Arab parties in Israeli governments in the future, and the long-term effects that may have, and whether potential coalition governments could also produce significant change in terms of religious secular issues in the country. So we have lots to watch in terms of what happens in the next month and then the coming months. And hopefully we won't have to do this again for a 5th time within the next year. Thank you so much for joining us. And it was great to have your expertise. And thank you for joining us in the middle of a busy day.